Another form of New Covenant theology, although they would not call it this, is progressive covenantalism, which is easy to identify because it is codified in the book Kingdom Through Covenant. And their argument is that the meta-narrative of Scripture is dictated by the progress from one covenant to another throughout Scripture. Which of course we would agree with that, but the way in which they put all of the pieces together, and as well as the way in which they interpret specific individual covenants, as well as their hermeneutical framework, is something where we would have some serious disagreements. There are strengths absolutely to Kingdom Through Covenant. Very careful and detailed exegesis. They do not want to impose a system onto the Scriptures. Now, I believe that they go too far in some ways and are inconsistent in some ways, but nevertheless, I appreciate the rigorous exegetical work that goes into their conclusions and their studies. I also appreciate the fact that, number one, they see a connection between covenants and kingdoms, and number two, that they see the meta-narrative of Scripture as being a progress from covenants, from one covenant to the next, because our confession in many ways expresses the covenant of grace in that way of being progressively revealed by farther steps, those farther steps being the Old Testament historical covenants, and at last being established in the New Covenant. Now, obviously, the way that all of that works would differ between their position and ours, but I appreciate that they are seeing that as opposed to simply one covenant of grace under two administrations. Gaining understanding of the 17th century particular Baptist federal theology and its larger context would be very helpful in engaging views like progressive covenantalism, because there are certain distinctions that were made back then in the 17th century which answer some of the concerns and positions of progressive covenantalism today. For example, one of the concerns of progressive covenantalism is what they view as an imposition of the model of the covenant of grace on all of Scripture. And the particular Baptists would sympathize with that and say, yes, we also want to identify the covenant of grace with a particular exegetical historical covenant, and that is the New Covenant. And so, whereas progressive covenantalism would, in a sense, throw the term or category of covenant of grace out the window, that's not necessary as long as you identify univocally the covenant of grace and the New Covenant. Another element is the covenant of works, whereas particular Baptists affirmed the covenant of works as it was articulated by all Reformed federal theologians, broadly speaking. That is an area in which progressive covenantalism could use some challenging from our particular Baptist forefathers, where it's not simply there's Paedo-Baptist covenant theology and then there's progressive covenantalism. Also, the particular Baptists ubiquitously argued for the distinction between moral law and positive law. And so we can sympathize with New Covenant theologians, progressive covenantalists, by saying, yes, we ought not to be using things like circumcision to dictate how we're going to govern the New Covenant, because those are positive laws that are abrogated. But if you account for the fact that there is such a thing as moral law, there is such a thing as law that is true independent of any covenant, then you preserve the perpetuity of the moral law, independent of Mosaic covenant, Abrahamic covenant, of any covenant. It simply is the moral law. And the ability to distinguish between moral law and positive law allows us to not go too far in what is abrogated, but also to recognize the discontinuity that does come through abrogation in the progress of redemptive history and the covenants themselves.